Hi everyone and welcome to Shah Lusso. Now first off, I'd like to give a big thanks to Zager Watches in Sydney, Australia for providing me with today's watch, and that is the Rolex Submariner 16610. That's right, the pre-ceramic and what is, in my opinion, the last old school Rolex.
If Rolex is the most recognized and widely known watch brand, and the Submariner its best known model, then without a doubt the 16610 is the most recognizable Submariner. If you think Rolex, if you think Submariner, even if you just think watches, the first one that'll come to most people's minds is the 16610. With a production run lasting from 1988 up until 2010, the Pre-Ceramic Submariner represented Rolex's unscathed emergence from the quartz crisis, as well as its meteoric rise towards the present day's landscape of shortages, wait lists, and premiums. The 16610 represented an evolution relative to its predecessor, but it had three major differences compared to the present-day 16610 LN. The white gold indices in the hands are smaller, allowing for more space on the non-maxi dial. The bezel is in matte aluminum, and the most evident difference is the slimmer lugs, adding to a more elegant and streamlined appearance. This classic elegance, carrying over from the previous generation, plus the 22-year production history, has made the 16610 the quintessential Submariner. One of the keys to Rolex's success is its mastery of proportions. They created a watch that looks good on nearly any wrist. At 40mm, it may have seemed big for the late 80s, but today it's a perfect balance for large and small wrists. The slim lugs on it compared to the current model make it a lot more friendly for the smaller wristed, but you can never mistake it for a small watch on a large wrist. And at 12.6mm thick, it also wears easily under a cuff, and despite its somewhat shaky bracelet, the case doesn't feel top-heavy or wayward. The clasp itself, like the bracelet, is firmly a product of the 80s. Thin and stamped out, with a clamshell and friction fit to keep it closed, whether at the office or the beach. And pre-2003 models also even featured drilled lug holes for easy strap changes. And this is one of the key draws of the 16610. Its classic design and slimmer look allow for more versatility. On the inside beats the same Rolex 3135 that's in today's ceramic Submariner. The workhorse movement was introduced on this reference and has stood the test of time for over 30 years in the Submariner, Sea Dweller, Datejust, and Yachtmasters at various periods of their history. It features the 28,800 VPH beat rate that's been synonymous with Rolex movements, as well as a 48-hour power reserve, quickset date, and Rolex's superlative chronometer certification, allowing for a variation of only plus or minus 2 seconds per day. As a dive watch, the Submariner wrote the book on dive watches. It sets the standard. 300 meters water resistant, unidirectional bezel, Triplock crown, Rolex oystersteel to protect it from corrosion, and depending on the year, it'll have either tritium, luminova, or superluminova for nighttime legibility, or in the case of tritium, providing character over time due to the patina. Another functional curiosity of the 16610 is its dive extension. Hidden behind a small button in the clasp, you can actually extend it over a dive suit, and this provides a very early example of what would become Rolex's flip lock and glide lock systems of today. In the late 80s and early 90s, the Submariner found itself moving further up market, and the attention to detail is evident with the continued improvements that were rolled out over its lifetime. White gold indices had already been added to previous references, but security features such as the laser engraved crown on the sapphire and the serial number and Rolex logo on the Rayhot were added in 2005 and 2007 respectively to help combat the ever-rising industry of fake Rolexes that unfortunately still thrives till today. And then in 2001, Rolex even fitted solid end links to the bracelet, perhaps to give it a more luxurious feel versus the 80s oyster links, though the bracelet itself wouldn't fully go solid until its successor in 2010. Interestingly, from 2003 onwards, Rolex abandoned the drilled lug holes that made for easy strap changes. Perhaps they realized that their fast-growing brand recognition was as much rooted in the oyster bracelet as it was in their logo or the cyclops on the date. Even on the inside, near the end of its production run, they started putting the parachrome hairspring, and to this day, Rolex will update the hairspring on older models to keep it within the 3135's present performance standards. It's difficult to tell if Rolex knew they'd keep this reference in production for so long. In the early 90s, there were even rumors that they were going to replace the Submariner altogether with what eventually became the Yachtmaster. But the Submariner survived and kept on improving, keeping up with technological advances as well as its ever-growing brand status and brand equity. And it provided a platform for the Rolex of today. Regardless of your preference of the old versus the new, it's without a doubt that the 16610 has earned its instant recognition in the watch world.
So that's my thoughts on the Rolex Submariner Pre-Ceramic. And it was a really great experience handling this watch because it was my first time really looking in depth at a vintage watch. Now, obviously we can debate whether it's really vintage because obviously it ran up until 2010, but I look at it as vintage because at the end of the day, this is a design and an architecture that's roots are in 1988. But the big thing that I took away from this is that it really does feel like the last old school Rolex in the sense that it has all of the quality and the utility that we associate with Rolex, but it's from a time where Rolex still wasn't a full-fledged luxury brand in the sense that it is today, where it commands these crazy premiums. It was made in a market where Rolex was still trying to push and sell its watches, whereas today, it's still sports watches at least. They fly off the shelves without any effort. But before I get too carried away in that, we first have to talk about the 3 positives and negatives of this watch. And the first positive I have to highlight is the fact that this is essentially a modern vintage watch with no compromise. What I mean to say by that is that you can still get this watch with superluminova, 300 meter water resistance, the laser engraved etching on the glass, as well as the engraved ray hot, both of which offer more security and are modern measures introduced by Rolex to help combat fakes. It still has the superlative chronometer status. You can still get it with white gold indices. And it's the same movement that's currently used in today's Submariner, the 116610LN. So that means that parts availability isn't an issue, as well as expertise in working with this movement isn't an issue because people have been working with it for over 30 years. It doesn't have really any of the compromises that come with a vintage watch. So that's a big plus because it means you can have that vintage experience without having a lot of compromise. And especially for early buyers, early collectors, that has a lot of appeal because it means you can limit your risk to a degree as opposed to taking a leap of faith with something that was manufactured maybe in the 50s, 60s, or 70s that was discontinued over 40 years ago. Building on that is the second advantage, which is that I feel the streamlined look of it and the more vintagey look of it also makes it a lot more versatile. Today, it's not rare for someone to be wearing a dive watch with a suit, but the difference is with this one, because it looks more streamlined, it means that it looks a little bit more formal when you compare it to the current supercase Rolexes. And it also means that it looks a lot better in my view on straps because with those big chunky lugs on the supercase, when you put a 20mm strap on it, it just looks very disproportional, whereas with the bracelet, obviously it fits a lot better. So from a stylistic point of view, it definitely is a lot more versatile. And also when you look at something like the non-maxi dial that it has, I think it's also a lot more legible. The current ones, obviously the indices are bigger, but also you have the same amount of text on the dial, so everything is all scrunched up, whereas having a non-maxi dial, it's a lot cleaner look, it's easier to read in my opinion. And then the third positive is the dive extension, specifically the way that you activate it. I like the fact that it has a little bit of theater to it. If you don't know about it and then you find out about it, it seems like you know this big secret that no one really recognizes. It just adds a little bit more theater in a brand that isn't really known for its theatrics. Rolex is generally sort of conservative and very by the books. This, in my opinion, I think it gives it a little bit more character. All these little quirks, little hidden tricks, they're things that just make the watch more entertaining and more fun. So I think that's a big advantage when looking at this watch. Moving on to the negatives. When I was considering the negatives of this watch, because it was the first vintage watch I've reviewed on the channel, I was thinking to myself, how can I really measure this? Because on the one hand, this watch was very good for its time. But on the other hand, people are going to be buying it today. So how do I square that with how I measure the negatives? In the end, I decided that because people are going to be buying it today in modern times, they're going to be cross-shopping it with modern watches. I felt it was only fair and relevant to measure its disadvantages to the other watches on the market today. And first and foremost is of course going to be the quality of the bracelet. This shouldn't come as a surprise. The pre-2000s Rolex watches, or at least the references that came out in pre-2000s, better said, they had really shitty bracelets. There's no other way to put it. They were very, very rickety. Definitely that's a big disadvantage. For all that I could praise the theatrics of its dive extension, there's really no charm in how flimsy this bracelet feels, so I have to point it out, and it definitely will be something that will count as a negative. The second negative is something that plagues even modern Rolexes, and that is of course the lack of AR coating. Even in the later stages of this watch's life cycle, there were plenty of other brands that were using AR coating on their Sapphire. So why Rolex didn't at that time, why they don't today is beyond me, but it definitely ruins the experience. From a practical standpoint, it makes it harder to read the watch, and from a superficial and from a collector standpoint, an admirer standpoint, it makes it harder to appreciate all the details of the dial. And then the last disadvantage is the fact that because this watch had such a long model history from 1988 up till 2010, the different variants, in my opinion at least, they make it so much harder to choose which one and cast a lot more doubt when you're in the buying stage. You really need to trust your seller because there's so many different opportunities for fakes. For example, if it's, a 90s model, you need to look for making sure that it doesn't have the laser etched crown and the engraved ray hot. Or if it's an earlier model, like right from the 80s, you need to make sure, okay, it definitely has to have tritium. It can't have luminova. Even if its dial still says tritium on it, what happens if it was serviced? Rolex might have replaced it. If it doesn't have the documentation, then you don't know if you're getting the real thing or not. You don't know if it's authentic. So it just requires a lot more scrutiny. And while some people may enjoy the thrill of, looking for making sure you have the right thing and all the right specs, for other collectors who perhaps are trying to take advantage of this modern vintage element of it, this can cause a lot of stress because it means that you have bigger chances of being duped, you have bigger chances of being disappointed. So that I think is a disadvantage to it. But all that being said, this is still a great watch, and I really, really do want to hammer home the advantage of that modern vintage element, because especially for earlier collectors, including myself, that's something that will be a big relief, knowing you could get something that has all the charm of a vintage watch, but without having as many of the quirks, the only one really being the bracelet quality. And that brings us around to the value of this watch. When we're talking about the value, the only thing is that there's a very wide range. The lower end of the 16610, you're looking at about $6,500 US. On the upper end, you're looking up to $16,000 US. And obviously that depends on quality, authenticity, originality. But the point being is that there's such a big range, but it is something you can get into a lot easier than, for example, a current generation Rolex Submariner, where prices start at about $8,900 US, keep going up to $15,000 US. But the interesting thing in making that comparison is that the upper cap of the previous generation has already surpassed the upper cap of the current one. So what that means is that there are already conditions for this collection that have made it surpass the current generation, that have made it a proper collectible. Value-wise, I think it's an interesting proposition. And when you compare it to the Seamaster of its time, that trades for as low as about $1,500 US up to about $2,500. So it doesn't even scratch the surface of the lower end of these, and that shows you really why this is the embodiment of Rolex. This is a watch that has its value because of its quality, because of its recognition, because of its utility, and that's before you even get into the current hype. So I definitely think that this is probably the best representation of what Rolex is as a brand before all the hype started kicking in. But in any case, let me know in the comments below what you think of this watch. Were you in the position to buy either a pre-ceramic or a current ceramic Submariner? Which one would you buy and why? And also let me know in the comments below, if you're gonna get one of these 16610 Rolexes, then which one would you get? Would you get one that's back from the 80s, as original as possible? Or would you go the route of getting one that's maybe in the later 2000s? Let me know in the comments below, because I'd love to know what you think of this watch, especially being the first vintage watch featured on the channel. And again, a big thanks to Zager Watches in Sydney, Australia for providing me with this watch. Do make sure to check out their links below and to follow them on Instagram as well. Make sure you follow at Shah Lusso on Instagram as well if you want to see all the infographics and some of the pictures featured on this video. And if you like seeing watch content, make sure you subscribe to Shah Lusso and hit the notification bell so you can know whenever I put up a new video. In any case, thanks for watching this video, and we'll catch you on the next one.